I recall, even when I was quite young, especially because École Pauline Hare is located near the downtown core, I recall all the way back in grade 1 and grade 2 that occasionally at our school we would find needles. And because obviously there was concern about that, the school actually had a program. They had a program where if you were a student and you found a needle or some other kind of drug consumption equipment, and you reported it to the duty master, that they would come and they would safely dispose of it, and they would put your name in a draw. And at the end of every month, they would draw, and you would win a prize. And so I was doing Great Dig in Nanaimo, well before there were supervised consumption services, well before there were other safe supply programs and things that we could blame. And Nanaimo has always had a complex relationship with substance use. I'm the president of the Harm Reduction Nurses Association. I'm the clinical director at ABI Health and Community Services. I'm also on the board for the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, and as of today, I'm an intern for communications and research with the International Drug Policy Consortium. So I spent a lot of time looking at drug policy. I spent a lot of time looking at the evidence. I spent a lot of time trying to understand what are the drivers of policy change in federal, provincial, even at the international level. Very early on in my career, I assumed that policy was developed for the benefit of people who needed it. You know, we identify a problem, we implement a policy to help keep people safe, to help ameliorate a situation, and that those decisions would be guided by evidence. And then as I continued in my harm reduction career, I saw policies and laws being implemented that didn't reflect the evidence, did not reflect an ethical approach, didn't embody the expertise of people most affected by those policies. And so then I thought, maybe people don't understand. And so I spent a lot of time talking about what is harm reduction? What does it really mean? You know, trying to help bring people along. And a lot of people need that education, but our policymakers don't. They actually have access to all of the evidence. They have access to all of the data. They have access to very educated policy analysts. They know what will help and they know what won't. And so now I'm really interested. I'm a master's student and I'm focusing on misinformation, disinformation, and moral panic because I'm really trying to understand what is actually driving policy. So that's going to be the crux of my presentation. The Harm Reduction Nurses Association is a Canadian national organization with a mission to advance harm reduction in nursing through practice, education, research, and advocacy. We do everything from collaborating with partners in the community, participating in advocacy events, to developing one of Canada's first harm reduction courses in post-secondary institutions. We just recently set up a scholarship so that nurses who work in harm reduction can return to school. So we do lots of stuff, and we're a volunteer board. We're small and mighty. We don't seek out government funding. We don't have money, and that's a bad thing sometimes, but it's a great thing because nobody here is driving what I say. I also want to acknowledge we are talking about drug poisonings. We are talking about involuntary care. We're talking about things that can be very triggering, and so please know if I'm using statistics, if I'm talking about data, those all represent human beings. They represent people that we love and we care about, people who are no longer with us. And so the intention is not to downplay or minimize those experiences that people may have had. Now, we've already covered some of this ground and I recognize the time, and so I'll try to be as succinct and efficient as possible. But yeah, we are now in the 10th year of a declared public health emergency in British Columbia. Just 4 days ago, we had our 9-year anniversary, so we are now in the 10th year. And folks don't realize that back in 2016, when an emergency was declared, the threshold to declare an emergency was just shy of 1,000 deaths. So 997 people died in BC in 2016, and the provincial health officer and the then Minister of Health, Terry Lake, decided this is too much, this is an emergency. Into the 10th year now, and over 16,000 British Columbians have died. Over 50,000 Canadians across the country during that time frame. And it is the single greatest cause of death for British Columbians aged 10 to 59. It amounts for more deaths than homicides, suicides, and motor vehicle collisions combined. And if we're going to talk about policy solutions, it's important to understand what is driving deaths in British Columbia. This is all publicly accessible data. This is from BC Coroner's Service, from last month's coroner's report. And this is what is being found when people are passing away from unregulated drug poisonings. This is in post-mortem toxicology, and so you can see there's a lot of fentanyl and a lot of fentanyl analogs, whether it's fentanyl, carfentanil, fluorofentanyl. These are synthetic opioids. They're not the stuff that you would find in a hospital. They're things that are being manufactured illicitly, and so the quantity, the purity, the composition is unknown. People are not afforded the opportunity to decide exactly what they're taking. Since 2020, when the global pandemic took hold, we started to see the emergence and saturation of benzodiazepines and other non-opioid sedatives in the unregulated drug supply. This is critical for a few reasons. First, naloxone, which is one of our best tools against overdose, doesn't work on benzodiazepines. Secondly, the combination of benzos and animal tranquilizers alongside opioids produces what we call a synergism. And that means the drug-drug interaction is not 1 + 1, but a multiplier. And so the reason why we're seeing people on our streets who are unresponsive for hours on end, who are experiencing amnesic effects, who are experiencing prolonged sedation, is because of the poison nature of the drug supply. And this red arrow here is hydromorphone. I'm gonna just add in here that there's a lot of moral panic about safe supply. That 3% is the bulk of safe supply prescribing. You don't see the media talking much about all of the black arrows that I just pointed out to, but you'll see over 500 articles written in the last 3 years about safe supply. It's also important to acknowledge that this is neither an opioid crisis nor an addiction emergency. If we call it an opioid crisis, then we will fail to acknowledge and respond to emerging trends in our drug supply, like this light green arrow, which represents benzodiazepines, which before the global pandemic was only showing up once in a while, and is now, as Jess said, in over 50% of drug testing results. We also can't call this an addiction emergency. If we do that, we will really lose a lot of people in the process. There are many, many people in British Columbia and Canada who do not qualify or have a substance use disorder diagnosis. They do not have an opioid use disorder. There are people who use recreationally, episodically. There are people who go to music festivals. There are people who use cocaine on the weekends. There are people who work in the trades who buy pills online for regular or irregular use, and every single one of them is also dying by drug poisonings. There are at least 225,000 British Columbians who use unregulated drugs, and less than half of them qualify for an opioid use disorder diagnosis. This is an us problem, not a problem for others. We also have to acknowledge that with the rise of benzodiazepines in the unregulated drug supply, the risk for brain injury has increased exponentially in British Columbia. A study from 2023 demonstrated now here in BC that people who experience at least one toxic drug event, one drug poisoning event, were 15 times more likely to experience a brain injury. And so we're seeing a significant burgeoning problem that we're not responding to, because all of these solutions that we're talking about, involuntary care, that does nothing to address the drug supply. It is a downstream approach waiting for people to experience a brain injury and then to treat them. That's not how we build public policy. The evidence, as Jess alluded to, on involuntary care is not good unless you're wanting people to experience harm. If we even accept the notion that the goal of involuntary care is to get people off drugs, we should ask ourselves, does it do that? And the answer is no. There's a study from 2024 that studied over 1,000 men with opioid use disorder in Iran and found that after court-mandated treatment, 96.4% of them had relapsed within the first 2 months. There's been systematic reviews that have found that not only does involuntary care not work, but it actually increases the risk for harm. There have been studies that have found that the risk of dying after leaving these settings is much higher than if people were not subjected to that intervention. Even former provincial health officer Perry Kendall has weighed in, stating the existing evidence suggests that mandatory addiction treatment does not lead to significant improvements in substance use outcomes and can be destabilizing, increasing the risk of subsequent overdose. So, if it doesn't work, why would we be pursuing this option? Well, we should ask ourselves who benefits and who is harmed from this. There have been a number of studies that have shown that Black and Indigenous people and people of color are disproportionately targeted by involuntary care. We have also actually seen studies be produced, even from parents of children who have been involuntarily detained, where the parents noted that they were disappointed because the involuntary stabilization did not have a lasting effect. From health justice, data has shown that girls, women, non-binary people, two-spirit people, and others with marginalized genders may experience disproportionate challenges and harms while being detained. There's been studies that have asked people who use drugs about their experiences of involuntary care. And those studies have shown that people who have been subjected to this intervention found it as being coercive and as a potential means for society to exert social control over people who use drugs. There have been studies that have shown and examined the perspectives of healthcare providers who have participated in involuntary care, where they felt as though they are experiencing moral distress because their values were out of alignment with their actions. And so, who benefits? We talked about who's harmed. Sounds like a lot of people. We've asked, does this work? Sounds like it doesn't. Well, the creator of the problem is often the one proposing a solution. Other benefactors might be people who gain power or resources from their solution, but ultimately there's something to gain out of it. And we should ask ourselves, how are these narratives crafted and shared? There's a couple of examples on the screen here, one of which from last year, where there was a massive increase in stories about people being exposed to illicit drugs in hospitals, right? And that led to a moral panic. Even though the evidence on illicit drug exposure shows that the risk is very low, what ended up happening was people actually canceled decriminalization. The government rolled back all of decriminalization because of these stories. Now this image on the left here is a current politician here in British Columbia. Her name is Eleanor Sturko. And in a conservative politic event, she compared the people of the downtown east side to stray animals. And she said if these were cats or dogs or pets, the SPCA would come and they would take these animals into care and adopt them out. We have to understand the meaning behind these narratives, right? If we weaponize stories of people experiencing brain injury, if we weaponize stories and say people who have addiction can't make good choices for themselves, if we weaponize stories and say people who use drugs are inherently dangerous, then it becomes very easy to accept an intervention like involuntary care. This is rooted in misinformation and disinformation. And we have to ask ourselves, what's the difference between those two things? It's important to know what the difference is between these two things. Disinformation is on purpose. People create disinformation. They amplify disinformation. And there is a motive behind disinformation. People who produce disinformation benefit from it. But misinformation is not intentional. Misinformation is what happens when you read something and you believe it's true, so you share it. So, when I share an article with my mom, she's often responds by sharing an article back with me from the National Post. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about this. And we have a conversation about it, right? Because she grew up in a generation where if it came from a piece of mainstream media, it was believed to be objective and truthful. And so when she shares those stories with her friends, she's not trying to spread misinformation. She's not trying to discredit evidence. But we are living in an ocean of misinformation right now. It is very hard to find out what is true. It's very hard to critically appraise all of the information that's coming across our desks. And there's a cascade of disinformation to misinformation, and if those run unchecked, and if those manage to create an emotional response within you, it is possible to produce a moral panic. Moral panics are a concept that was developed by a fellow named Stanley Cohen back in 1972, and it essentially looks at how we can take what is deemed to be an emerging concern and blow it completely out of proportion. What happens in a moral panic is someone notices something, a problem is identified, it sparks some anxiety, but then there's immediate hostility towards the perceived perpetrators of those harms. In this case, oftentimes people who use drugs are portrayed as deviants, as criminals, as lesser than. And because they're portrayed in that way, it makes it easier for folks to say, okay, this punitive approach probably makes sense. There's consensus in a moral panic. So there's a large, broad social reaction, usually on social media, right? Someone posts something, we can take an example with Decrim, the video of two people smoking crack in a Tim Hortons. Someone took a picture or video of people smoking crack in a Tim Hortons, they posted it onto Twitter, and then thousands of people reshared it, politicians reshared it, added their 2 cents, said, thanks a lot, Trudeau, right? And they managed to create this vox populi where it feels like everybody is talking about this. Everybody is worried about this. This is an urgent problem that we have to deal with. And so there's disproportionality. The extent of the conduct or the threat it poses is exaggerated. That one story gets shared, it gets changed, it gets reshared. It sounds like it's happening everywhere. It sounds like it's new, but it's only new because we're paying attention to it because it's on our feed now. And then there's volatility. If this moral panic creates enough of an outrage to change voting patterns, then people in power will abandon their own policies, they will abandon their own values, and they will change course in order to continue retaining power or getting power. And so I'll leave you with this note here. How do we resist the moral panic? That's scary to think about that. It's too big. Well, you don't have to take it all on your own. Some important tidbits include understand and acknowledge the truths within a panic. An effective piece of disinformation is one that is wrapped in truths. So if we go out onto our streets right now, we will see things that make us distressed. We will be uncomfortable with the amount of people who are deprived of housing. We will be uncomfortable having to step over someone or check on them because we're not sure if they're breathing. It is not a good feeling to see people hurt this way. That emotion is real. Everybody is feeling that. Now they're being told to feel a certain way about it. They're being told to affix a blame to that thing. And that's where we start to lose folks. But if we can find the common ground and say, yeah, this is scary. I'm scared too. I wish we could all be safe. That's common ground people have a hard time arguing with. We also have to make space for people to come back. I talked about misinformation being unintentional. There is such a thing as the backfire effect. And so sometimes if you present someone with evidence that runs contrary to their beliefs, rather than accepting that evidence and changing their beliefs, they will double down. They will become embarrassed, they'll feel ashamed by it, and they'll actually, just America's a whole case study for the backfire effect, right? They're doing it right now in real time. We do that as individuals all the time. We feel our ego slighted, we feel like, this can't be wrong, this is, in a moral panic, it's about your safety or your children's safety. And so if someone suddenly tells you you're wrong, you feel threatened by that contrary opinion. So we have to make space for people to come back. We have to allow them to be wrong and to not feel absolutely shitty about being wrong. Otherwise, we're not gonna grow the umbrella, we're not gonna have more people join us. We have to push back against misinformation and disinformation at every opportunity. You can do that in little ways. You don't have to stand on a stage, or you don't have to, go and challenge your government or yell at the Prime Minister, although if you want to, that's fine. Let's just wait to find out who it is first. But you can have difficult conversations with a family member, right? When you see your relative share that National Post article, sit down with them and explain to them why you don't agree. If you see your local newspaper publish an article about harm reduction and they use one of those terrible pictures of like a needle in a puddle or something stigmatizing, I email them all the time and I'm like, hey, just so you know, you don't have to use that picture. There's a lot of other ways that we can visually represent this issue without immediately putting needles in public spaces into people's minds. You can also do this not on your own. You can join groups. You can join groups like the Harm Reduction Nurses Association. You can join groups like Mom Stop the Harm, the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, Doctors for Safer Drug Policy, NANDU, the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. There is a group for everyone, sometimes multiple groups for everyone, and there's strength in solidarity. You can actually bolster a movement by adding your voice to it rather than trying to strike out on your own. Understand root causes and common ground. Say, I'm not safe until we're all safe. And in understanding root causes, we can actually grow the movement too, because they might come for harm reduction first. People who use drugs have always been the easiest target to punch down on for politicians, but it doesn't stop there. This is about bodily autonomy. This is about agency of choice. And so if they come for harm reduction and we let them, then the next thing they're going to do is come for gender affirming care. And the next thing they're going to do is come for reproductive rights. We actually share a lot of commonalities with other struggles. And if we understand that and show up to their movements, we'll have more people show up for ours. Drug policy should not be guided by anybody but the people most affected by those policies. And so if you want to do something, listen to a person who uses drugs. Talk to them, understand their perspective, center their voices. If you're asked to be a part of a group and it's about drug policy, and you look around and there's nobody there with lived and living experience, the best thing you can do is say, why are we doing this? How do we know this is what they want? Have we invited people to join this table? That's a really great allyship move that is quite low risk on your part, is just making sure the right people are there. And then knowing the root of these problems, knowing how a moral panic works, knowing how misinformation and disinformation works, you can cut through all of the noise and demand accountability from your politicians. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I don't even know. But anybody who gets into power deserves to be held accountable. And so if someone comes out there and says, we need to do involuntary care, ask them, how does that stop the deaths? How does that address the poison drug supply? How does that get people housed? And they can't answer that because it doesn't. So challenge power structures. That's what they're meant. That's what they're there for, is for us to challenge them. Politicians are empowered to represent us, the people, not themselves and their motives. Thank you.